Good afternoon, everybody, and also to everybody who's following us online today. It's really my pleasure today to introduce you to Professor Sara Yeo, a science communication researcher at the University of Utah. I'm not going to give away too much about her background and her journey towards this point in her career because she's going to share some of that with you in the presentation. I just want to say that for me, meeting and working with people like Sara is part of what makes science communication such an exciting and rewarding career path. She's one of the researchers that I met through the PCST network, which is the Public Communication of Science and Technology. I really encourage you to have a look at that, pcst.network. It's a fantastic network to join, where you can engage with fellow researchers, practitioners, and get to know about events around the world and also get to share. For me, it's been really valuable, also engaging with Sara around teaching in science communication, research methodologies, etc. So today's topic, humor in science communication, is an interesting one. It's one that we may have ambivalent feelings about it, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from Sara. She's done some work on this. It's not your only focus, but something you have looked at. And I'm really looking forward to the talk and also the discussion afterwards. Sara will speak for about 35 minutes. And so as we go, think of your questions, think of what you'd like to challenge her about, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Thank you so much, Sara.
Thank you, Marina. Hello. Should say hello to the in-person people first, right? Thank you again so much for having me. I am on the last leg of a holiday trip, actually. I am currently on sabbatical this year. Which is, I'm very fortunate to be on sabbatical to be able to explore kind of research interests, but I'm on the last leg of a sabbatical. A quick story, I came because it's a birthday trip for me and I wanted to go on safari, and so I went to Zim and got off the truck and sprained my ankle really poorly, and so good thing I was on safari because you just eat and get driven around. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah. My work, at least the work that I'm going to share today, is primarily supported by the National Science Foundation, which is the federal granting agency in the United States. And I cheekily sort of put X and traded the Twitter logo out. You'll see the Twitter logo show up again. Nobody tell Elon, but you'll see that. Feel free to tweet and share my work as you would like. Most of the work that I'm sharing today is already published, and if you would like the published articles, I'm happy to share those in any way because most of them are paywalled, and I do not believe that paywalls should be any kind of barrier to research anywhere. And so I offer this everywhere, whether you're affiliated with a university or not. Please feel free to email me. If you tweet at me, it'll probably take longer for me to respond because I'm not a great communications professor and that I'm not so much on social media, even though I do study it. I rely on my graduate students to tell me what's new, But so I'll start probably by telling you how I came to science communication. My route to science communication is a little bit circuitous. It's not direct, and Marina and I have talked about this. There's not a very clear route to any type of professionalization in science communication, whether you're going to be a professional science communicator or a researcher. And so I was born in Malaysia, and I completed, did I go to kindergarten? I actually don't know. Anyway, grade 1 through 12 in Malaysia. I actually took the British O-levels when I was in Malaysia. And then after that, I'm going to say I decided to get a degree in oceanography, but really I wanted to study marine life. And my parents helped me find a university that was able to do that. So I went to a small liberal arts college, a private college called Hawaii Pacific University in Honolulu. I got my undergraduate degree in oceanography, which is actually a pretty rare undergraduate degree because it's a very applied science. I minored in chemistry while I was there. I thought I was going to be a chemical oceanographer studying carbon cycling in the world's oceans. So I ended up also going to the University of Hawaii at Manoa to get a master's degree. So I have a master's degree in oceanography. I turned into a microbial oceanography in the meantime. So I studied bacteria and other microbes in the surface oceans. And I actually worked on a small island off of the island of Oahu in a bay. It was really lovely. You would have to take a boat to your lab every morning. So I did that for about 3 more years. And then I decided that Hawaii is too nice. So I moved to Wisconsin. This is what it looks like for possibly 8 months out of the year in Wisconsin. It's pretty cold. It's actually not even always that nice because it's not much snow on the ground all the time. So I started a PhD program in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department. Often civil and environmental engineering are grouped together because the researchers who study wastewater treatment through microbial processes also do some environmental work through microbial processes. And so that's what I went to study and sort of spent about 2.5 years in the engineering department when I took a class with Professor Sharon Dunwoody, who was at Wisconsin, and unfortunately she passed last year, but she was very big in the science communication and science journalism world, and that was my introduction to science communication. And then I found a small department in the Ag and Life Sciences. It's much bigger now, I think. The Department of Life Sciences Communication, where after being in an engineering program for 2 years, I decided I'm going to switch to this program. I got a second master's degree and eventually my PhD in this program because I enjoyed the research so much. And I'm a social scientist. My dissertation was on how we seek information about science through sort of our own individual traits. I think none of the results that I found in my dissertation would be surprising to us now, right? The idea that partisanship and political ideology plays a very large role in how we seek information, how we unconsciously avoid information. But at the time, for science information, right, we can show that for political information, public affairs stuff, but not so much for science. And it turns out, even for science information, we are inclined to go toward our partisan or political sort of homes in terms of where we find our own media. And so I did my dissertation on that, and that really sort of informed my research, right, as I moved forward. So after Wisconsin, I found a job as an assistant professor at the University of Utah. And overall, I study public opinion dynamics. I think about how messages found in media, excuse me, inform our perceptions and our opinions, right? So media effects research. I think a lot about selective exposure, how we seek our own information, how we unconsciously avoid that information. And then the other part of that is processing that information, how we use what we call heuristics or mental shortcuts to process information. But more recently, and recently, and probably in like the last 5 or 6 years, I've started to think more about practice and the practice of science communication and the research that might inform that practice, right? And so if I think about, well, what are the mental shortcuts that we use quite often, things like political ideology and partisanship? These are not necessarily things that a professional science communicator can change, right, about their message. And so for me, that was not what I wanted to study. And so I moved to studying things like affect and emotion, right? How we feel about something often influences the decisions and the judgments that we make. And so while I'm not advocating sort of using emotional triggers, right, but there have been a lot of campaigns. You can think about fear appeals, for example, in cigarettes. You know, how those types of emotions influence how we understand messages about science, health, environment. And so all of this, as I mentioned, is through the lens of science and environment and risk. And that's really informed by my own background in science, right? Being a bench and field scientist before, I was very interested in this. My master's in communication it was actually about climate change. I've since moved away from studying the topic of climate change because it is a very complex topic. And my research is primarily in the United States. And we know in the US, it's very, very partisan and a very, very polarized issue. It's not a lot that can move us on the topic of climate, unfortunately. I just wanted to mention that another piece that I've become interested in recently is the open science movement. And thinking about how this plays out in communication and our perceptions of scholarship and how it impacts society. So thinking about the principles of open science, we sort of all agree that transparency and reproducibility in science, broadly writ, not just communication science, are positive and good things that we can aspire to. What we don't agree on is the tools that we use to get there, right? So we may have heard about pre-registered studies or registered reports, badging in some way where you have open data sharing. What we haven't really discussed are the ethical issues around these things and what are the perceptions, right? So if I have a study that maybe isn't that great, but it's pre-registered, does a reviewer see it as better, for example, right? And these are the kinds of communication type questions that I've been looking at as well. And so I'll just set that aside and put a pin in that. I'm happy to talk a little more about that, even though this is an area of research that is newer for me. But for today, I wanted to make a little bit of a case for communicating science effectively. I think this audience is probably on board with why we need to communicate science effectively. COVID has really brought this to the fore, I think, for many, many people outside of our science communication spheres. But back in 2015, Alan Lesher, who was then the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, this is AAAS, it's the largest professional organization of scientists in the United States. You know, he realized that this is a really important thing, right? And increasingly, as I have been at Utah, I've heard sort of more about more scientists, right? Who often have a revelation that science communication is suddenly important in their work, right? It's not just the science. They can't just do the science and publish it in some journal that not many people are going to read, but that science communication and some sort of public-facing communication or engagement is important. And then in 2017, the National Academies of Sciences in the US took this up. They wrote a report on it. That committee that helped write this report is the Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication. It still exists. I'm fortunate enough to serve on this committee currently in its iteration. And it is now thinking of very much more about sort of professionalization, how boundary spanning might be important, right? So how do we come to professional science communicators? There aren't clear pathways, as I sort of alluded to earlier. To become a professional science communicator, at least in the United States, where most of my experience is, what we see is people who have degrees in science who don't want to do the bench sciences, who don't want to be in the lab anymore, but they want to communicate, right, and use what they've learned to talk about science more broadly. But there's not a clear path. And so, you know, it can be pretty stressful, honestly, for a scientist who realizes, well, I don't really want to be a lab scientist anymore. I want to do this other thing, but now I have to volunteer my time. I'm not getting paid to do this, right? And so you can also look up the colloquia on what is the science of science communication increasingly being called that. This is just research in science communication. Much of this research comes from the social science perspective. So survey research, quantitative generally, although I do think that we do need more qualitative work. I know Marina has done some of that. And there are other ways to investigate science communication. And I'm happy to share links. All of these videos are available for free on YouTube and publicly available. So my research, I think I mentioned a little bit, has transitioned more to this idea of I want to do research that is practical. This is not always the case in the field of communication in the United States. A lot of the research that we do is pretty abstract, doesn't have very clear practical implications. And I actually believe that I could do much better on that front for myself, but there are various incentives, right, in the American academic system that push you to publishing in these journals that practitioners generally don't read, right? And so, you know, the tenure system kind of encourages this. But this is a figure from a recent book, Strategic Science Communication, by some friends of ours, John Besley at Michigan State and Anthony Dudo at the University of Texas at Austin. Great book. I was fortunate enough to review it. That was fun. And they have this sort of idea around applying, so they're both in public relations departments, applying strategy and strategic communication to science communication or to talking about science. They have They identify goals, objectives, tactics, evaluation of the activities that you do, and so forth. And I like to use this figure because the work that I do primarily sits in the tactics area. So my research is sort of squarely located in this little number 3 box here. I think about sort of the specifics, and today I'll be talking about the specifics around how we might use humor to communicate science. And so that's kind of where the sandbox in which I'm currently playing. And so what I often do is I'm an experimentalist, so I sort of take messages and make different variations of a message, run an experiment, measure some sort of psychological state that that message might induce. You can think about emotions, for example, in terms of humor. Does it make someone laugh? That is a psychological state, right? In terms of emotions, does it make somebody feel a particular emotion? Does a message make someone feel that emotion? And then thinking about some sort of persuasive outcome, right? Outcomes such as, I'll talk about these today, intentions to engage with science content on social media, even sort of persuasive outcomes around perceptions of the scientists or the communicator themselves. The other thing I look at, and this is sort of coming from my dissertation, is the individual traits. Not all of us are the same, right? We are all individuals. And sort of broadly, we can be categorized into groups of individuals based on different dimensions, right? And so individual traits are often these psychological traits that we have, personality traits, you might say, not the big 5 personality traits if you are a sociologist, but other traits. Specifically in my work today, I'll be talking about need for humor. It is a personality trait that encourages someone to be, people who are high in need for humor like to tell jokes. They like to be in humorous situations, right? And it's not a dichotomy. There's a whole gradient of people who are more or less of these sort of individual traits. And so this is generally the path that my research takes. Most of it is experiments. In fact, I will be primarily talking to you about experiments today with one content analysis. Humor. So this is what I've been focused on for since 2018, I believe. And I've published a few things on this, both through funding through the National Science Foundation, some internal funding at my university, but sort of thinking about emotion and humor and how we might use that to communicate science. When I first started this humor journey, I was kind of surprised by how little work had been done on the effects of humor. So you could find, and you still can find, some research in the advertising space. You can imagine why that might be important, right? If I can make someone laugh, maybe I can make them feel better about a particular brand, or I can make them more likely to purchase a brand. But there wasn't that much in science communication. And humor is something we use every day, right? Most of us encounter some sort of humor or something funny in our daily lives. It is very ubiquitous. But somewhat understudied, especially in the science communication space. And because I enjoy humor, I thought it would be a fun thing to study. It turns out when you have to read the theory on humor, so there's also a lot of humor theorists who try to think about what makes something funny or what are the techniques or types of humor, it becomes a little less fun. But anyway, before we jump into the actual research, I wanted to show you some examples of funny tweets about science. And I think I'm supposed to call it X now, but we're just going to call it tweets and Twitter for now, because I don't know what's funny. So this is a particular hashtag, overly honest methods. You can still look this up on Twitter. Oh, this is so awkward. Do we call it X? Do we call it Twitter? You can still look this up, and it's scientists taking to social media to talk about the realities of doing science. This really intersects with that open science that I am interested in, because it sort of gives public audiences an insight into how science is done, right? I think for many of us who maybe have never been at a science bench in a lab working, sure, we've taken science classes, but if we've never actually worked with the realities of day-to-day science, we think that science is a very clean process, right? We run an experiment, we find the results, we write them up, and so on. And that's generally how we're taught about science, right? In school, at university, sort of lower level science classes, that's generally how we're taught. We're generally taught that it's a very clean process. But the reality of science is that it's not. Things break in the field all the time. You have to use everyday hardware products to collect scientific data. That's very common. Morgan Edwards' tweet is one of my favorites. This happens to all of us, right? I can't share the data because I don't remember what the file names are anymore. These are the realities of day-to-day doing of science, and they're funny, right? But they're also a specific type of funny. They are satirical. They are sort of poking fun at the enterprise of science. There's also the hashtag fieldwork fail. So this is an artist's depiction of some of the tweets they came across. And these are all about being in the field and trying to do science in the field and all the mishaps that occur. And there are many. There are many. As a field scientist, I have had many mishaps. And one last one I wanted to share. So this is the hashtag review for science. This is scientists reviewing everyday items on Amazon or other purchasing websites because they use them for scientific purposes. And then they write a review based on that scientific purpose. Okay, so humor in science is everywhere online, right? And it shows up a lot on social media. But so the first question we had was how much science is actually present on social media. And so what we did, like every communication scholar, we took up a content analysis, which is not my favorite method, but that's okay, right? So we looked at Twitter and Instagram for a year between 2016 and 2017. And we used a couple of search terms to look for science-related posts. I'm going to share the search terms with you in a minute. But I don't want you to read them all because it's a block of text. I just want you to see how we searched for them. We came up with over 110 posts, which is a very small proportion of any topic on Twitter and Instagram, right? So while there is science content, at least in this year, it wasn't that much. My expectation is if you count public health, which wasn't necessarily included in this, if you count public health in there, that number would increase quite a lot, right? Especially post-COVID. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. The comma is not a decimal point. I know that is a conventional difference, but over 110,000 posts, right? And the search terms did quite narrow it down because it had to be both science and it had to be both humorous. And then we manually coded that, which you cannot do with 110,000 posts because the graduate students are very upset when you ask them to manually code 110,000 posts. So we randomly sampled a very small proportion of that. We coded for things like, is it relevant, right? On Instagram and Twitter, the hashtags are used just to push posts up in the feed that are not necessarily relevant. They could be total gibberish, right? But they're using that hashtag. We also coded for the number of likes and retweets or reposts on Instagram. Again, remember this is Instagram and Twitter in 2016 and 17, not as we see it today. And then also the types of humor. And so I think the types of humor is most important, but here are the search terms. Don't read it all. What I do want to point out is that there is a block of terminology and hashtags that are about humor. And we combine those with a block of hashtags about science, right? Or together, science funny, science humor, science jokes. And so we're trying to capture sort of the population, right, of tweets and Instagram posts about funny science. Didn't matter what science. So you can imagine that a lot of content is missing, right? Content that doesn't have the hashtag science, but has the hashtag energy, climate, and is also funny. Those things are missing, right? But as a first pass, we decided that this was a good enough proxy to give us a sense of what is on social media that is about science, that is funny. And so here's what this looks like. We coded for the types of humor. We coded anthropomorphism, which is this idea of giving inanimate or non-human objects like atoms, right? Eyes and legs and human-like characteristics. A speech bubble is a human-like characteristic, for example. So parody is making fun of something, using something in popular culture to make fun of something. A lot of Star Wars references, you might imagine, right? There's satire and sarcasm. I showed you some examples of that using fieldwork fail and overly honest methods. And then wordplay. There's a lot of puns in science humor. You've probably all seen the image, the drawing of the cell with a phone taking a selfie, right? See, nobody laughs at that joke anymore, but that counts as science humor. And so what we find, right, is that satire, sarcasm is the highest. The pink bars are Instagram, the blue bars are Twitter. But satire, sarcasm, wordplay, and anthropomorphism generally are sort of in the highest proportions. And these are very different types of humor. I'm going to refer to them as types. The humor theorists will refer to them as techniques of humor, some of them. There's actually no clear agreement, right, among humor theorists, still arguing about that. But some of these types of humor are pretty benign. They're not offensive in any way. And some of these are more offensive. There's a target, right? You can imagine that anthropomorphism and wordplay generally do not have a target. When I say, I show you a picture of or a drawing of a cell taking a selfie, there's no target of that joke. It's possible that's not going to offend. It's very unlikely that it offends anyone, right? I mean, that example is actually a combination of wordplay and anthropomorphism because a cell taking a picture of itself is human-like. Satire and sarcasm, on the other hand, is less benign, right? It's much more, it can be much more offensive, and there's typically almost always a target of that joke, right? Some theorists differentiate satire and sarcasm by one of it is targeting an individual, one of it targets an institution. In this case, it's much too difficult to tell, right? Or to pinpoint the actual target of the joke, because often jokes can have multiple targets. And so we sort of combine that. Okay, so we have a sense of what is out there. So we did this content analysis, and then we thought, well, what potentially is associated with the number of likes and the number of retweets? This idea that something is more popular, right? Metrics of popularity on social media. Does humor matter in this case? You can just ignore all of these except for this 3 rows. And what I want to show you is that controlling for all of these other variables in here, so we coded for number of followers, the number that particular account was following, right? Regardless of that, the presence of humor, especially the wordplay and satire, is positively associated with more popular tweets, right? So a higher number of likes. Presence of satire associated with a higher number of retweets. So this gives us a sense that using some humor is potentially correlated with popularity in some way. And it's not really a unidirectional link. It's not necessarily causal. I'm not saying use humor, therefore it will be more popular, right? It could be the other way as well. But there is some positive association between the number of likes and the number of retweets and some types of humor, at least the presence of some of those types of humor. Okay, so great, found that out, sort of. And humor is something that is often recommended. I took this table from a paper that Ayelet and Bruce Lewinstein both co-authored, and it's about sort of summary of advice for scientists, and use humor comes up as one of these, right? I think one of the challenges with this particular recommendation is that we don't understand to what effect what is the effect of humor? What are the boundary conditions on the types of humor that I might use? Should I use some types of humor versus others? Should I make fun of myself? Right? I think a lot of scientists are quite prone to using self-deprecating humor. It might matter who I am as an individual, right? There's a common sort of saying that women are not funny, for example, right? Which I think a lot of women are showing that this is not true if we think about comedians. But there is sort of still some prevailing thought around, who you are matters, right? So I think, for example, about the comedian Samantha Bee versus male comedians. Samantha Bee is often thought of as an angry woman instead of just someone who is funny, right? Like Trevor Noah is just thought of as funny, even though he's making a lot of political commentary. Samantha Bee does very similar things, but is often just sort of written off as an angry woman. Well, I'll get to that. But first, the idea of to what effect is humor? What is the effect of humor when we use it in communicating science? And again, I was surprised that this is pretty understudied. And so the first question is sort of for us, how does humor affect people's engagement with science, right? So I did this with a basic science issue, this like sort of chemistry joke. And then I replicated this with 3 different issues that are more recently, artificial intelligence, microbiomes, and climate change. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I'll start with the first one. So in the first study, we manipulated the types of humor that were present in a tweet about science, and I'll show you the tweet in a minute. And then we measured people's intentions to engage. So this is the persuasive outcome that I was interested in, right? People's intentions to engage with science, more science on Twitter. So are you more likely to follow science? Are you more likely to share this with someone and so on? Are you going to like it? The intervening psychological state is the experience of humor, right? I can show you many messages, funny messages, some funny, some not, but humor is pretty subjective. Some of us might think it's funny, some of us might not think it's funny. And so this measure of how funny you think it is quite key in this research. Okay, and then individual traits. I mentioned earlier need for humor, this idea that some of us much more like to be in the center of sort of a humorous group, to be telling jokes, for example, right? And so how do sort of groups of people who have a range of need for humor, how does it change, right? How does this relationship change among these folks? Okay, so here then are the 4 conditions. I actually took this from a tweet that I found. This is the no humor condition, right? It's just a science fact. You can see the hashtag is science, hashtag is fact. And then just facts about atoms loses an electron, it becomes more positive. We had number of tweets and likes. And then we had a additional sort of comment to strengthen the manipulation there. No humor in this comment down here. And then we said, well, okay, so let's put, so this is one end, the no humor end, and this is the original joke, right? So this is the original joke that I found online, on Twitter. 2 atoms are talking. One says, I think I've lost an electron. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm positive, right? It's play on words. So there's wordplay in it, and there's anthropomorphism in it, because you have atoms that have human-like characteristics. They're having a conversation. This little electron is running away in the corner. And again, the comment emphasizes that condition, right? It is a play on words. It has anthropomorphism. You got to keep an eye on it, right? Okay. And then there's 2 in-between conditions where you have only one type of humor, right? You have either anthropomorphism or wordplay. And so that's what we have here, just the anthropomorphism. So we've taken out the play on words in the text, right? Are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure, instead of, yeah, I'm positive, which would be the wordplay. Notice that only the no humor condition has hashtag fact. The others have hashtag funny, right? Indicating, again, these are sort of markers that this is a joke, right? Made by the original poster. and then the wordplay version. So taking out the sort of eyes and legs and, you know, human-like characteristics. And we actually changed the text as well to say two scientists are talking, because the atoms, that would still represent some sort of anthropomorphism. Okay, so what I did is I showed groups of people one of the four conditions. I had about 1,530 respondents in the sample, randomly assigned to one of the four conditions. So we had about 380 per condition. We measured, we asked them after they saw the tweet, right? To what extent did you think this tweet was not entertaining or entertaining, not humorous, and so on. So that's how we measured experience mirth. We used 8 survey questions to measure need for humor. These are validated questions taken from the literature. I'm happy to talk more about these, but I didn't want to kind of go through that here. And then engagement intention. So this is the persuasive outcome made of 3 items. I would retweet, I would like, and I would share this tweet, right? This idea that I'm going to engage with this information in some way. Okay, so here's what we found, right? This graph shows how much humor was experienced on the y-axis, and then the various conditions on the x-axis. So we have the no humor condition, we have the anthropomorphism condition, the wordplay, and then the combined condition, which, you know, should be the funniest, right? And so on. And indeed, we find that the combined condition is the funniest, right? The no humor condition is the lowest, and there's actually no significant difference between the 2 single type of humor conditions. It's a little lower, but that's not actually significantly different. Okay. So respondents in the combined condition, most humor, no differences in the 2 between, and then the lowest. One thing I want to mention is that this went from not at all funny, right? I didn't experience any mirth at all to lots. And so something in the middle is kind of like, okay, it's a cartoon, right? Cartoons in some ways, some sort of line images still are sort of more amusing than just text. All right, so there's that. And then, so we have, what we find is that for various manipulations, if the respondent doesn't experience humor, like they don't think it's funny, there's actually a negative association with intentions to engage. You can imagine, oh, I think this is a bad joke. I don't think it's funny. I don't want to share it. I don't want to like it. I don't want to retweet it, right? What the graph I just showed you with the various conditions and mirth, you see that, you know, if with the combined condition, people experience the most mirth and so on. And among those who experienced higher levels of mirth, that was associated with greater intentions to engage, to like, to retweet, to share. So this is a positive outcome, right? If I think this is funnier, I'm more likely to share that. And these personality traits also matter, right? The numbers don't matter here. I'm going to show you a graph of this. So on the X here, you see experienced mirth. As we go up the scale from left to right, people think it's funnier. And then we have the persuasive outcome on the y-axis, right? I'm more likely to share and retweet if I am a higher number on the y. And then we see, so this particular line shows respondents who scored relatively low on the need for humor scale. We have respondents who scored sort of medium on the need for humor scale. And the way I decided medium, low, and high is the mean and plus and minus 1 standard deviation. And high on the need for humor scale, right? So among those respondents who have higher need for humor, right, mirth matters more, right? You're much more likely to engage with that, or to at least say you're going to engage with that tweet. You also found it funnier, and you like to be the source of humor. You like to be in a humorous situation, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Great. Now, the question for any one of these, any sort of science communication type media effects research is it replicable? Because we find very small effects generally, right? Because you can imagine that it's just a message. It's just one time you see this thing for 30 seconds, and then you report these outcomes. And so is it real? Does it actually happen in the real world? And so for me, because I'm also interested in open science, the replication is really important, right? And the replication with adding more complexity, perhaps. And so what I did was I used 3 issues that I mentioned: global warming, artificial intelligence, and microbiomes. And this time also threw satire into the experiment, which is a much more challenging type of humor, because it is much more subjective, right, than the others. So this came out, I think, just last year. And we did the same thing in the global warming experiment. We had wordplay and satire. So we have a no humor condition. We have just wordplay, just satire, and then combined. In the AI condition, no humor, anthropomorphism, satire combined, and so on. And this, I'm just going to show you what the full conditions are. So this is the 2 types of humor condition. Okay, so this is the global warming, and you have satire and anthropomorphism here. You have, right, the dinosaurs are talking, the snowmen are talking, and you have some sort of wordplay. This is the artificial intelligence condition. We actually had a science communication researcher who is also a cartoonist, it turns out, draw all of these for us. His name is John Cook. He is in Australia at Monash University. And then microbiomes. And so, you know, as far as science jokes go, right, they're not the most funny things, but we pilot tested them before fielding them so that we knew that there was some variation in how funny people thought these were. So these are the sort of 3 different conditions or 3 different issues that we had. In each issue, there's 4 conditions, right? No humor, 2 single doses of humor, and then 1 combined condition. Okay, so there's 12 conditions total, 3 by 4. Again, so we had about 2,000 people, 2,200 people per issue. So 2,000 people in the global warming, 2,000 in artificial intelligence, 2,000 in the microbiomes. Very fortunate to get a large sample on this. And so in 12 conditions, it's about 550 people in each condition. They're randomly assigned to these. Similar, because I'm trying to do a replication, these are very similar. I use the same questions to measure these things, right? I don't want the, you know, different results to be a function of how I measure something. So I'll skip through that pretty quick. And so here is a similar graph to that first bar graph I showed you, but I'm going to point first to the 2 on the right of your screen or as you're looking at it, the artificial intelligence and microbiomes. We find similar results, that respondents of the combined conditions have the highest levels of mirth, as we would expect, right? It is the funniest condition, and so it should hopefully result in the most amount of mirth. And then, you know, it is not significant. The difference between the 2 middle conditions, the single doses, are not significant. We've seen this result before in the first study, so that's great for us. So great, that works for artificial intelligence and microbiomes. What we found is that for climate and global warming, this is not the case, right? In fact, the levels of mirth are all statistically similar across all these conditions. And this is the day-to-day of science. In hindsight, we realized that every single condition had anthropomorphism in the global warming conditions. And so there are, you know, reasons why we think that didn't work. The anthropomorphism is one of it. But also, this issue is much more salient. So again, the samples from the United States, the issue of global warming there is very polarized, right? So some people might find it funny and some people might not. It probably depends on where you fall on the political spectrum. So only in 1 of the 3 issues were our findings not replicated. I show this again because I wanted to mention that there is anthropomorphism in all 4 of these conditions, and that certainly was overlooked. Again, that could have contributed to the results that we had. Okay. And then when it comes to thinking about that individual trait, need for humor, similar results as I explained before with artificial intelligence and microbiome. So, if I'm able to replicate these findings in 2 out of the 3 issues, I'm pretty excited about this, right? And it gives me a lot more confidence in the findings that I have, right? It gives me a lot more confidence in my ability to say that humor is, yes, possibly a good thing when it comes to communicating science. It can be positive. It can be used for positive things. It can encourage, perhaps, right? It is at least associated with people who are more, with people being more likely to engage with science content, at least on social media. Okay, so not only, right, can humor be used in message effects research. So to what effect? We have that question of humor, but also how does humor affect people's perceptions of scientists? Something I hear quite often from scientists is that, oh, well, we're not very likable, we're not very personable, we're not very human, we're not very warm, right? And perhaps humor is one of these things that sort of reduces the barrier, right? Now I can see that you are more like me, that we are more similar, even though you're a scientist and maybe I don't have any science background. Okay. So one of the things we wanted to think about is whether sort of humor can also break down these barriers between individuals in terms of likability. But the question of, does humor undermine my expertise? If I'm a scientist going up there and making a joke, does it make me also, right? Do people then see me as a joke? Does it undermine sort of the expertise that I might have? And so what we did was we ran an experiment. Don't think I did that. Did I do that? I'm sorry. Yeah, so we ran an experiment where we showed people there is a different slide on the Teams. In any case, we showed folks 2 videos, one that had laughter associated in it, right? And one without laughter. So if you watch sitcoms, right, comedies on TV, there's canned laughter in the background. That is a social cue that something is funny, right? And so for like a comedian who is going up there and saying, making jokes about science, for example, you can do the same thing. You can have canned laughter in the background that cues an audience that this is a funny thing, right? And so we also then, we also then measured perceived likability and expertise of the communicator. I wanted to show you just right. And then our persuasive outcome is this idea that comedy can be a valid source of science information, right? We can learn about science from many places. And in fact, most of us, school is a very small proportion of our lives where we might learn a little bit of science. In the US, not a lot of undergraduate students choose to major in science, right? Even though it seems like it is actually many more students who are not in the sciences. And so we get science from a lot of different places. If we are fortunate enough to live in a city with a museum or with some sort of science center, right, we can engage with science that way. But a lot of our science comes from media in different ways, right? So think about Big Bang Theory, for example, the show where you are, people are seeing what scientists are like. I will say it's not the best example of scientists because in the Big Bang Theory, at least in the early seasons, all the scientists are male. And they're all very socially awkward, right? Probably not the best representation. In any case, so these are the things we measured. It's actually a YouTube clip. You can find it on YouTube. This is Vince Ebert. He is a German physicist, and he does stand-up comedy, science comedy. Yes, it is a German physicist doing science comedy. So we took a short clip from this YouTube video, and I'm happy to share the slides so you can have the link later and just watch. Some of it is quite funny. He does make a lot of fun of himself, but we didn't actually take the part where he made fun of himself. That is a question for later. We just sort of took the part where he was making science-related jokes, and we either had laughter in it or no laughter in it. Randomly assigned people to each of these conditions. This was an mTurk sample for various reasons. We had a pretty small sample, 100 respondents per condition, although that is sufficient in a lot of experimental cases because you have enough variance in the demographics. And we measured, again, perceptions of comedy as a valid source of science information. So this is the persuasive outcome. These are the actual statements that people agree or disagree with. And then we measured perceptions of the scientists telling that joke, right? How much of an expert do you think he is? How likable and warm do you think he is? And so these are the things we use. And what we find is that, first of all, when there is laughter, people think it is funnier. This is expected because, again, laughter is a social cue for that, right? But also, those who found it funnier also rated the scientists as more likable. And surprisingly, it did not seem to undermine his expertise. So if you found it funnier, you also rated him as more of an expert, right? Like he knew what he was talking about. And then that perceived expertise, right? More expertise, you would say, oh yes, comedy is also, I can also get science information from this. And so, this is a little bit of evidence. I haven't replicated this yet. It's hard to find science comedians. But this is a little bit of evidence that humor in some ways, and using humor can maybe perhaps make you seem warmer, right? More approachable as a scientist, perhaps. Okay. And there's also a direct effect from mirth, a direct relationship between these. All right, so who cares? What does all this matter? As I mentioned, I'm quite interested in sort of being able to say, what can we do when we communicate science, not just these kind of abstract theoretical things, right? So what? I think making people laugh, there's evidence that it is good for communicating science. With all these caveats, right? So we know that it is positively associated with the likelihood that someone is going to engage. Okay? We know it makes them more likable without undermining their expertise. There is the big caveat of the type of humor matters. If the humor is benign, right, it is likely to be more positive. It is likely to have more positive outcomes. If the humor is more offensive or biting or acerbic, probably not so much. And there are many questions. I think like any research, we get many more questions than answers at the end of this, right? So what about who the joke teller is? Like I mentioned before, right? Does it matter if the teller of the joke is a woman? Does it matter if it's a man? Does their race matter? And then one question that I've been really interested in recently is, can humor start to build bridges between in-groups and out-groups? A lot of psychologists think of humor as a form of social control, where I can make a joke with another scientist, and with some shared knowledge, we have created an in-group where people who are not scientists are now no longer part of the joke, right? So I'm excluding them in some way. And so thinking about whether you can use humor to build bridges between groups is something that is sort of the next step here. And so I'll just sort of wrap up. I've been working mostly with practitioners in science communication. There's a group called 10th SciCom, and they take scientists' talks and they make them more entertaining. They make them less dry, I suppose. There's a group in the United States called STEM Media, is a Black-owned and Black-run company. He is an engineer, and he's very interested in sort of creating media content for engineers that sort of represent diversity and scientists in all of our forms. The Utah Forge project is a Department of Energy funded project on enhanced geothermal systems. So in Utah, geothermal energy is a big area of research, and enhanced systems allow sort of geothermal energy to be used anywhere, but it comes with the consequence and potential of microseismicity, right? So potentially very small earthquakes, because it uses the same technology as one would use in hydraulic fracturing. And so they're very interested in that. The other project that I've been working on recently is a collaboration with the public broadcasting system. They have an online site called Terra, and they put science content out there. And they are very interested in expanding their audience. In the US, the public broadcasting system is sort of an older system that is very well known for science documentaries, and their viewership is very white and very male. And so they're really trying to expand the audiences for their content, and they're trying to do that online through some sort of media. As I mentioned, thinking about open science practices in communication, I started using things like pre-analysis plans, data sharing. I am very careful about data sharing because I think, you know, respondents need to consent to sharing their data. And if I believe if we don't get that consent, we probably shouldn't share those data, right? There are different views on this, which is why I say that. But it has consequences. Sometimes when people read about data sharing, they're less likely to participate in your study. And so is there some systematic bias in that? And then sort of while I'm on sabbatical, I've been reassessing sort of the rigor and the methodologies that I've been using in my own research. I've been thinking a lot more about qualitative research. I've been trying to learn more qualitative research, which is very challenging. So hats off to all of you who do qualitative research. And that's kind of going. So the last thing that I wanted to say is I am the director of the STEM Ambassador Program. This is a program funded by the National Science Foundation. And what we do is we try to train scientists to build relationships with their communities. The relationship building is focused on some sort of event because that's what, you know, something tangible to talk about, to engage with communities around. And we try to encourage scientists to I want to say be more human, to put on the different hats that they wear in everyday life, right? And so I'll give an example. I teach dance in Salt Lake City, and I try to use that, right? And not just that I'm a scientist or an academic. I try to use that to connect with other communities that, you know, may not always have access to science. And with that, I will go ahead and stop talking and take any questions. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry I talked so long.
I definitely didn't want to stop you because it was fascinating. And we, you know, when you first hear about humor in science communication, of course, people may think, really, is that really a serious, you know, science communication research topic? But clearly the way you've presented it just puts it into a whole different perspective and gives us lots of things to think about. You know, the advice, I was interested that you quoted that example from the Lowenstein and Baran Sabari paper, where they just say use humor. And that's, you know, to think about it more. What do we mean, and what practical advice we really can give scientists? Also responsible advice about responsible use of humor, I guess, and effective. You want it to be effective. You don't want to offend people. We know that humor is very culture specific. So I will maybe kick off with a question. Then I'll first give the people who actually went to the trouble to come here today, and then maybe with Manoa we can hear about online questions. I want to ask you, during COVID, I became aware that there was actually a group of researchers in Belgium doing research on COVID humor, you know, humor during COVID. And so this raised the question to me, are there some things that where humor is really just not appropriate when it's about death and disease and things like that? But we should stay clear of humor, or is humor okay in any circumstance?
Yeah, so you made it very easy to answer that question because humor is probably not okay in any circumstance. But there are people who study this idea of like dark humor and humor associated with terrible tragic things like death. And that it's very contextual. I'm going to give the social science answer of it depends because it really does. You know, you have to know something about what you want to achieve with your communication and your use of that humor. So you have to know something about your goal or your objective. You have to know something about your audience, right? I don't think, you know, and I think about professional comedians, for example. I don't think they go to many shows without knowing a little bit about who might show up to that show, you know? And so you can imagine that a very liberal-minded comedian might go to a very conservative place and do a show. And they might learn a bit more about what to expect from that audience, and they might temper their jokes based on that, right? And I think similarly in science communication, depending on what the context that we're talking about is, depending on the audience, depending on what we want to achieve with that communication, all those things matter. So I couldn't possibly just say, just use humor, right? Which I think is maybe a knee-jerk response, because we use it all the time, right? But even when we use it in everyday life, we have to know something about the person that we're using the humor with. And so that is important. I wouldn't make a joke. Like, I would make a joke with some friends and not others, right? All of us would do that because we know something about that audience. And I don't think it's any different in sort of using it to communicate science. I just think it requires support, right? It requires infrastructure to do that. You have to, in order to know something, any single communicator, is very hard to do all that work by yourself. You know, having some support structure in place to do that, I think is really critical.
Except on social media, you don't know.
Except on social media, we sort of know our audience in a way, right? Because we know who is following us.
Or beyond that.
Not beyond that. And so, you know, who might see it in the public realm? It's also possibly something we don't mind so much about. There is something about the digital space that gives us a sense, right? And you see this in the work on incivility and toxicity online, that even when you have to log into something like Facebook and you have your name there, people are much more willing to be uncivil and to be rude. So there's something about this digital space that makes us braver somehow.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, so from the floor, anybody else? Deborah, please. Just maybe speak up so that they can hear it on the online thing.
Should I turn?
You measure the work outcomes for the different humor styles compared to the control. Is there any assessment where you ask the people if they actually got the joke? Because if it's something like the ions,
Yeah.
using or gaining an electron, people might have, especially if you have 550 participants per category, if you have 1 in 5 people getting the joke in the one and not much more, 2 in 5 getting the joke in another, then it accounts for the differences immediately without having a means to capture the content of the joke. But not, I didn't get the climate change joke at all.
Yeah.
So
that is another possible explanation for that, right? That it's like people didn't get that joke, although they did find it somewhat funny, you know. And so the anthropomorphism part of it, and this is the part of humor theory that is really interesting. Just the fact that you have put some sort of human-like characteristics can make it funny for some people. So I didn't measure whether you got the joke or not, but the random assignment of people to each of these categories should account for those differences in theory, right? With a large enough sample. And with 550, it probably should. The other thing I would say to that is that actually, I don't mind if you don't get the joke, right? I just want to know if you think it's funny. And I know those are somewhat related, but sometimes you can laugh at things where you're not really sure if you got the whole joke. And the other thing is, and that is a really interesting question, because this idea of getting the joke gets at the question of how much cognitive resources we might put towards something, like understanding a message. There are competing hypotheses about this. So the hashtag also matters. The hashtag funny also matters. It indicates, it's another social cue that it's a joke. But sometimes there are some people, I think, who will see, oh, this is a joke, so I'm going to write it off. I'm just going to, you know, try to maintain that mood, right? That positive mood. I'm just going to write it off. I'm not going to worry too much about it. Great, it's funny. I might think it's, you know, some level of funny. Maybe I don't get the joke. It's okay. And I don't put too much cognitive resources toward that message. The competing hypothesis is that using those cognitive resources to get the joke actually spills over into sort of more rational, more type 2 processing, more in-depth processing of the message itself. And we haven't actually parsed out, and there's other people working on this, we haven't actually parsed out which one it is. Some people just discount the message that comes with a joke, Or do some people use those cognitive resources that are put into getting the joke to also understanding the message? So it's a really great question that we haven't measured, also partly because it's hard to measure getting the joke.
Not reporting whether you got it or not.
Yeah.
Understand that you
Right.
have to get it.
Right. Yes, yes. And there's some sort of social bias, right? Maybe I want to say I got the joke because I feel a little bit embarrassed if I didn't get the joke, you know? It's very hard. And then if we've thought about open-ended, just writing in what you think. But then you have a bias in who responds to that. Similar to what you said,
What
right?
about taking the respondents' own interpretation out and using the you now for the online space, facial recognition algorithms to profile the response?
Yeah. We have a lab that will do facial recognition, but we're pretty limited by what sort of the technology can do. I actually haven't done any of those lab studies. We have been thinking about how we might do that among different populations. Part of the challenge there is you can't do as many people. You can't have as many people. And so we're trying to balance that. It's something we've thought about. So I think that's a really great line of research, but we haven't done it quite yet. No.
Okay, we have two questions from the online.
Oh, yeah.
Guys. Good morning. You're coming next, and then you please. Okay, so let's do this. If you're happy to stay a bit longer, I'm just worried that the online people will sign off. Good morning, quickly.
Do you okay, I'm just one question. Thank you for the brilliant session, Sarah. I am fascinated by the analysis you carried out on humour as a tactic for science communication. I see that most of the information or results come from Europe and other developed countries. Do you have any information or examples about the same strategy being used in African settings?
No, I wish I did. Thank you for that question. I do not have data from
It's okay.
African countries. There is a huge gap, and we talk about this all the time. There's a huge gap in representation from just the Southern Hemisphere, right? Not just the African country, but the Southern Hemisphere in general. And
So let me know if you want to do research.
yes, and data are hard to get. Data are expensive. Samples cost a lot of money in the US. I could not do this without the support of the NSF. And so this is very challenging.
And the next one, come on.
Okay, there we go. I'm interested in laughter, but it's not always a joke. I use it a lot. I use a lot of laughter in my facilitation, but so it's not a joke, but it's full of laughter. Humor can also be latent aggression, and one needs to be really careful about that. What do you think?
Yes. Yes. And well, I mean, like we mentioned, I think using humor is contextual, right? It depends on your goals. It depends on your objectives. It depends on your audience. The example of COVID and using humor in COVID, it also psychological distance also matters. You can imagine that in February of 2020, making a joke about COVID was probably in very poor taste, right? Farther out, with more psychological distance, it is perhaps in less poor taste, depending on what that joke is. And so it is very context specific.
Okay, so let me come with Bradshaw, and then both of the colleagues at the back, please. Bradshaw.
Thanks. Three questions.
Yeah.
You said all ones.
Yeah.
So the first one is you said that you did work on processing the first.
Yeah, I ask you to come to the front, because otherwise the people, but maybe you to come and join us here. Then if you ask a question, the people can address it. So just stand here and speak to the.
So you said you did work on processing, and I just wanted to ask if you're aware of work on retention, humor and retention. So it's what happens, does it have an effect on your ability to retain information, because then you can retell it, and that's
a good question.
an effect. So that is the one. I know it's not what you presented.
Yeah,
here,
I'm going to answer that quickly because
Yeah.
I think I haven't looked into that, but I think in the teaching literature, there's a lot more humor effects work in the teaching literature, but often with younger students,
So
right? Not adults. Yeah.
Then the second one was around types of humor, which I found really interesting. And I initially presented on text, then you brought in video, and that broadens the spectrum of types of humor. And I wondered if one could look at, spectrum of sophistication in a way. So slapstick, for example, didn't feature, but might be very popular and might correlate with certain contentious issues like, global warming, or so we could start to correlate between beliefs and types of humor. It's a bit ambitious, but
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that we could do with that. So many other types and techniques of humor that haven't been studied. So now I'm running one on just audio because podcasts are very popular, right? So audio humor. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. It's shockingly understudying the effects.
the last one's just a comment. It's about open science, and it'd be really interesting for you to think about in groups and out groups in open science.
Yes.
Everyone thinks it's open, it's for everyone, but especially from a global south perspective, there's cost involved, and that's one.
There's
thing
a
we
lot
have
of cost
our
involved. Yeah,
resources.
Yeah.
Lots of good intentions, but there's quite a lot of excluding people from.
very much agree.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Just come and join us.
Hi.
Hi.
Just if you can come and stand here, because the camera.
Okay, so I saw in one of your previous slides, they were like these categories of hashtags like science and humor, maybe a bit of both. My question is there a specific kind of ratio for maybe using a hashtag by each for, I can say for a wider reach and also metric wise? And also other question that's a bit quicker, it's like, I know the medium we've usually on Twitter like a single box, will there also be other mediums, like say a comic strip of like building up to,
Yeah.
I can say a punchline. Those are.
Yeah. So first question was about, remind me again?
About the hashtags, and
Yes.
is there like specific
Yeah,
a
the
ratio?
ratio. So actually no ratios there. We just tried to be comprehensive. I know it looks kind of equal, but we just try to be comprehensive. And I think it depends on what we wanted to get, right? And for us, trying to get everything possible-ish, right? Not topic specific, because then the first hashtag becomes extremely large. Yeah, so not really ratios, but just trying to be comprehensive around that.
Okay.
And the second question, yes, comic strips, definitely. One of the things we're concerned about is this idea of external validity, what you might see in the real world, right? Because things like XKCD comics about science, not super popular compared to things you might come across on social media. I mean, TikTok is, but where I understand a lot of people get science information now. We have a bit of a challenge in the US around TikTok and researching TikTok, as you might guess, and I'm happy to talk about that, not recorded. But it's a big space, right? This kind of interactive short vertical videos. So it's a great, so many questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, my own question is the fact that I know your research was basically test inclined, and I just want to talk about the results. You were like, using Humour will make you more likable. And I feel like Humour, probably for me, is that humor is much more easy to say when you're talking than when you're writing. And I'm seeing all of these terminologies, and I'm like, whoa, so this what's really applicable to this text? I mean, so it makes it more complicated. Are you thinking of doing a study talking about the scientists themselves and how are they to infuse humor into what they are writing? Because we know what we want to do, but infusing it in the writing terms, it starts to talk about writing styles and all of those things, which we are not used to. So I'm just asking, are you thinking of doing something in that line? Because I know now you're saying your result is humor is good. But how well can the scientists themselves use them?
Yes, so this is, I think, important where I don't expect every scientist to be funny or to be a comedian. And so this is where structure and support matters. So people who are science communicators who think about these kinds of things, right? Not everyone is going to be funny. Some people are better at this than others. And, I think everyone needs help with what they do in terms of supporting your communication. So it's not just a single person, single scientist doing that necessarily. So one example is the 10th SciCom group. They actually rewrite scientists' talks to be funnier, right? To give better talks. I mean, I've sat through many science talks where I'm practically falling asleep. If it was funnier, it would be much better, But you need help with that, right? We all need help with that, I haven't looked into text specific because, like you said, it's much harder to see humor in text than it is in a video or an image, right? But at least in the experiments that we ran, we try to include like the hashtag funny, and that is a social cue, or laughter. you know, an additional social cue to say like, this is supposed to be funny, like we think this is, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I can think of so many more questions to ask you. The thing that I'm really interested in is also the personality type of the scientists themselves and whether they are willing to have humor either on social media or in person. There's a whole lot of questions around there. But certainly anything that can help scientists connect, you know, that evidence we have, that element of warmth is so important. It may work for some, it may not work for all, and it's quite hard. It's not easy to come up with a good joke that will work and that will not exclude people and alienate people even more. So, Sarah, thank you so much for a wonderful sort of glimpse of your rich research body in this field and for inspiring people with ideas. I really hope that some of the people online and some of the people here will think about opportunities for doing some of this kind of work in a Southern Hemisphere or Global South context, which would be really amazing. And we'd love to, you know, collaborate.
Yes, I would love to collaborate. I would love to talk more about
we have an ally now in this field.
Yes.
So thank you very, very much, everybody. Thank you for Marty for organizing all of this, for getting everybody online, for getting everything set up here. Really appreciate it. And yeah, enjoy some. I've got some groups on Facebook and Twitter that I follow just for the science humor because I really, really enjoy it. So it's also that just taking a break from the hard stuff and just finding some sort of breathing space for me that it's sort of almost therapeutic. So I really enjoyed it as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more. So please email me or connect with me somehow. Yeah.
And for those of us who are here, we are going to have some coffee and cake.
That's lucky us.